So welcome everybody to the first grand rounds of the new calendar year. I'm Robert Claudel, I'm Program Director here. I'm not the actual formal introducer for Dr. DeWitt, but I would like to make sure you know who you're hearing from today. And this is one of our PGY4 residents who's doing his official grand rounds presentation to us. Dr. Eric Goodwin, formerly of the faculty, now in the Great Northwest somewhere, will be beaming in at some point and will give a little bit more extensive introduction. But without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. DeWitt. Thank you.
Hello and good morning. Thank you for attending my virtual grand rounds. You may have seen the title already. I'll go ahead and skip over to that. It contains a word that you're likely not familiar with, and it's probably for good reason. It's a reference to my own kind of take on psychotherapy as we do it in our world and our work. In short time, we'll discuss what the word means and, more importantly, what the theory kind of entails. In general, we're going to have a lot to talk about today. There are two big parts to the talk. The first one being just kind of an overview of topics and theories that are pertinent to what we're talking about. And, I want to say out front that I can't comprehensively cover all those topics. I can't prove them to you. That's not my intention. My intention is to share them to kind of educate about their existence and about some of the takeaways, and then to contextualize my approach to psychotherapy. So first, our disclosures, of which I have none. And then learning objectives. I don't know if this is in the way for you guys. There we go. So the first learning objective is pertaining to what's called priority monism. We'll get into the details of that a bit, but in general, it's saying the universe, so mind and matter, are all composed of one substance. And the priority, that's the monism part. The priority part is saying instead of a fundamental particle like an atom or the subatomic particles being the most fundamental thing in the universe itself is taken as the most fundamental thing. And we'll get into that a bit. I know that's probably a little out there at the moment. The second one, we'll talk about some of the prevailing ideas that have come through academic thought with regard to consciousness and about how that's implicated treatments. And then, of course, we'll get to the namesake of the grand rounds. We'll talk about the theory that I have and how I use it in my day-to-day. Okay. So what is the psychosphageria I'm referring to? It contains a few things. One is a structural model, which is really just how the mind is organized. You've all here likely heard of the psychoanalytic ideas of the ego, the id, and the superego. I'm not going to supersede those ideas. I'm just going to elaborate on them in my own kind of fashion and kind of relate those ideas to my own. It also contains transformational theory, which is really just saying this is what it is about therapy that I think helps people get better. Of course, if you know me, having a regular old theory is not good enough. I have to be out there with it and a little more grandiose. So I call it a meta-transformational theory. Hopefully it'll become clear as to why I would call it that. If not, you'll have space at the end to ream me for that. So this weird word, where did it come from? What does it mean? Psychosphageria, it's composed of two words, both Greek. Psyche is the first one. It's a reference to the totality of elements forming the mind. I'll throw this out there just in case I have time to elaborate on it later. It was a reference to a character in Greek mythology who fell in love and went through terrible trials in order to be able to be married to the object of her love. It's often understood to be about the soul redeeming itself through love. And then sphageria is a word that was probably coined by Paracelsus. He was an alchemist back in the day, interesting historical character, but it was used synonymously with the word alchemy. It has changed a little bit in its use over the years. And hopefully it'll become clear as to why this process I'm describing today will be a bit of an analogy to alchemy with regard to the core idea being reformation of a substance through its dissolution and recoagulation. The substance in this case being mind or consciousness. All right, so why on earth am I presenting on something this weird? Well, a few reasons. The first one being, I have always been fascinated with just how absurd it is to exist. And I'll put it to you this way. Here in this virtual space, we have a bunch of highly intellectual apes sitting in a room constructed of binary code relayed through information shot to satellites back down to this rock covered in water, screaming around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour. And the sun itself being screaming around a black hole at 490,000 miles an hour. So we take things for granted, I think. And for whatever reason, it kind of strikes me sometimes. I could be called a mystic with Neoplatonic philosophical leanings. And I've observed the ways in which, mysticism and religion and wisdom practices can convey healing to people. So I wanted to try to make sense of all that and myself and in the way I do work, because I think it's important. And sorry, Dr. Govan is texting me asking for the link, so I'm going to send him that really quick. I apologize. And this is definitely not the usual layout of these things. Okay. All right, hopefully that works. So keep an eye out for his presence. Okay, we'll move on a bit. And again, why are you presenting on something so broad and abstruse? I really, what I want to do is share this perspective that's helped me in my own personal and in my work life, and to inspire, thoughtfulness and the same kind of creative license in my peers. So that's kind of the gist of this slide. But we can get into it. So getting to the very heart of the predicament in our psychiatry that we're kind of facing in a lot of ways. The reason why this kind of abstruse talk is maybe permissible in the hallowed halls of scientific inquiry. This is a quote taken from Jeffrey Lieberman's book, The Shrinks, essentially saying, all these other specialties can objectively and tangibly touch the pathology, visualize the pathology. Whereas in psychiatry, we've struggled defining what pathology is or demonstrating that it does in fact exist outside of just objective behavior measures. If you've worked with Dr. Wong in the inpatient unit at Norton, you've likely entered any one of several philosophical discussions. One of my favorite quotes from one of these discussions is this. This isn't an issue of confusing patients or who the patient might be. It was a comment on like a broader question of who does treatment serve? Are we serving just the patient? Are we serving their family? Are we serving society? And the answer can be pretty muddied. It's something that we don't often take time to sit back and consider in our day-to-day work, but I think it's something important. And so at the end of the day, for whomever and for whatever ends we're providing treatment, I do think we can definitively say that what we're treating is consciousness or mind in psychiatry. And of course, it's telling me this mail that I tried to send Dr. Goodwin is not sendable. So again,
Abe, I'll text him the stuff. You continue.
Can you? He wants it to his email. Do you have? I don't think you have his email right now, do you?
I'll text him and find out, man.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, so we're treating consciousness. That's where I left off. What is consciousness? You could look up a ton of different resources on this, but I think at the end of the day, you kind of get to the same answer. I took mine from this guy, Arne Dietrich. He's a psychologist, and of course, there is no accepted definition of consciousness. We'll get into this bit, but it's okay if you feel frustrated at this point. I don't expect it. To elaborate a little bit on that, consciousness remains a mystery. This is taken from Susan Blackmore out of her book that is titled above there. Whatever way we try to wriggle out of it, our everyday language and scientific and philosophical thinking, we seem to end up with some kind of impossible dualism. So consciousness is slippery. You try to grab hold of it and you realize what you're trying to hold on to is split into two pieces. Of course, as I mentioned, you may already be frustrated with just how intangible this stuff can be. And that's more than reasonable. You wouldn't be the first person or the first people to be frustrated. In fact, that's the next thing we'll talk about, is behaviorism. So the founder pictured on the bottom actually is John Watson. It could be said that behaviorism was kind of a reaction formation to the just the intangibility and sometimes the lack of practicality with this discussion of consciousness and what it means and where it comes from. In fact, the biographer of Watson, David Cohen, was once quoted to say, behaviorism was a self-conscious revolution against consciousness. I do think behaviorism brought us insights and it brought us progress, and I'm not trying to besmirch that by any means, but I think as a field, we've kind of agreed that it has not been a sufficient sole perspective by which we can practice psychiatry or psychology. Because essentially it takes the subjective out of the account, and it's really hard to address a person's subjective experience and augment that experience if we're kind of writing it out and just looking at objective measures. Oh, and then on top was B.F. Skinner. He kind of elaborated on Watson's ideas with the idea of operant conditioning and the like. So yeah, consciousness was kind of put to the wayside in terms of the subjective content. And later it crept back into the academic setting through several different vectors. This quote on top is taken again from Susan Blackmore, her book. No one got quite as far as banning the use of the word consciousness, but it became acceptable later. This guy, William James, gradually developed a new form of philosophy called radical empiricism, which insisted experience must be at the heart of any philosophical inquiry and understood as fundamentally about meaning, not just physical data. His work, that of Carl Jung and others, contribute to the explicit focus on spirituality, transcendence, and the transpersonal psychology. And together with the rise of the countercultures in the 1960s, created other paths for this topic to creep back into the academy. I said earlier, there's no accepted definition of consciousness. That's fair. But for today's talk, I think it's important to have some idea of what we're talking about. So I'm going to align with a lot of the philosophers and describe consciousness as experience. Simply what it's like to be a subject experiencing the universe around you. And I'll provide more concrete examples of what that might mean later. But before I do that, I think we have a new presence in the room. So I will give up the floor for a moment.
You need to unmute your mic.
Okay, here we go. Sorry. Hello, gang. Long time no see. So I'm here to introduce Dr. DeWitt after he's already started, because time is irrelevant these days. So here we are. Dr. DeWitt was born and raised in E-Town, Um, completed his biology degree at University of Kentucky and an MD at University of Louisville. He was wellness officer and House Staff Counsel from 2019 to 2022, and he's published an article, Our Ouroboros Psychiatry Circular Reunion with Old Wisdom, in the Louisville Medicine magazine in 2020. How come I don't know about this? Anyway, my own experience with Dr. DeWitt is that he's extremely thoughtful, has a intense curiosity, and really just kind of wants to connect everything to everything else in a coherent way. And I really dig that. So I'm very glad to introduce this topic, a very fascinating topic. So that's enough for me. Carry on.
Okay, I couldn't find my unmute button for a second. So yeah, no, well put. I want to connect everything with everything. And sometimes that can be tough and it might not come across too coherent or cogent. So, again, I'm happy to clarify later. Okay. So in talking about consciousness, of course, there are a ton of disagreements between different schools of thought. One of the biggest ones is with regard to what is consciousness made of? Is it a separate thing from physical matter? Are they two expressions of the same thing? And it depends on who you're asking. A dualist will tell you, they're separate entities. A monist will tell you they're the same underlying substance expressed in different ways. Underneath those two topics are the headings there, the dualism and monism. I've listed some different schools of thought that might be attributed to one or the other. You'll notice there's an asterisk on a couple of these. It's because they can be considered anomalous monism topics. So there's some interchange and some uncertainty about how to classify some of these things. And epiphenomenalism can be also described as a dualist thought too. So it gets kind of hairy. Okay, another big topic of question in the discourse on consciousness would be with regard to the idea of self, and other ego theorists will tell you that you and I are separate entities. There is a continuity between me now and me in the future, or me in the past. A bundle theorist will tell you that a person is just an illusory concept, as is the continuity of self. That we have some spiritual / religious parallels to these ideas. Ego theory would be more like an Abrahamic soul in the major religions of the world, and then bundle theory is more like what's called a Nietzsche and anatta in the idea of Buddhism, being impermanence of form and impermanence of self, respectively. So who's right between a monist and a dualist, and a ego theorist and a bundle theorist? The answer is I don't know, and I don't have a great answer as to how to get there. But this idea I'm presenting to you today kind of works on the idea of embracing that paradox. You can find evidence for both. You can sit here now and confirm that you are a subject experiencing the world. But if you look at it, with enough resolution, you might think, oh, maybe that's an illusion. So I'm not here to answer that for you. I'm not asking who's right. I'm kind of asking, so what? What do we do with it? All right, so already, like I said, I can understand some frustration and confusion as to where are we? First, I'll say we're here. Mind and matter are undeniably interrelated, but they may or may not be made of the same stuff. Self and other and continuity therein are apparent immediately in our experience, but may or may not be illusory concepts on a large enough size scale. And what we're entertaining is mind and matter exist and interact. What each is made of can be viewed as semantic. Self and other do exist, if only by means of an illusory perception. And you can confirm that right now. I hope. All right. And then, so I put a recap here again, just to kind of hit some of this home because I know it can be abstruse. And where we're going next is consciousness is a ubiquitous property, variably expressed, dependent on factors inherent to the individuated subjects in their relation to the surroundings, in a manner such that a self can be considered to exist and not to exist. And that'll have some therapeutic significance that will hopefully become clear as we go. All right. So the first stop on our list of theories that do have some experimental evidence or data that support them is that of CEMI. It's consciousness electromagnetic field information field theory. And this gentleman pictured here, his name is John Joe McFadden. He's a big proponent of this theory and kind of consolidates a lot of the research findings into a relatively cogent language. So often in our field, this question comes up: isn't mind an emergent property, or isn't consciousness an emergent property of neural correlates of consciousness, often called NCCs? And my answer in regards to especially this theory is yes and no. So we'll continue with the frustration. I'm going to lay out this is actually his language. He's going to lay out some of the big three things of this theory, what basically the postulates. The brain generates its own EM field. That is well known. The second one is a little trickier to prove, but there is supportive evidence. The brain's EM field is the seat of consciousness. And the brain's EM field itself can influence neuronal firing. This one is actually easier to prove, and he says is inevitable. We'll get to the meaning of why am I talking about this here in a second too. But first, a little bit more about the theory. Again, or not again, but I'll apologize. There's going to be some slides that are information heavy. I'll just read over the pertinent parts. In recent years, a lot of neuroscientists have become interested in this idea of neuronosynchrony. Experiments from all over the world really have not correlated this firing with consciousness, but rather the EM disturbances generated by the synchronous firing. He says the simplest explanation is that the brain's EM field is conscious awareness, the semi-field. Goes on to say radio sets and TVs are designed to be sensitive to fields of radio waves, but in fact, all electrical phenomena are sensitive. Neurons fired by specific structures, which we know about, but mostly they're gated in such a way that only massive changes in the brain's EM field are likely to influence their firing. In a busy brain, however, there are many neurons teetering on the brink of firing, near that action, that threshold potential. And those teetering neurons are more exquisitely sensitive to the field, the fluctuations in the EM field generated by the brain. So that field, or what might be called our consciousness, or a representation of it, will come into play when the brain is poised to make delicate decisions. And several papers have demonstrated some support for that idea. The concept of information encoded this way is very familiar to us. We do this all the time in day-to-day life with TVs and images, radios, and all that stuff. What he's proposing is that the brain is both a transmitter and a receiver of its own EM signals in a feedback loop, generating a conscious EM field as a kind of informational sink. The information transfer might actually provide distinct advantages over what would be traditionally thought of as neuronal computing, in that it rapidly integrates and processes information distributed in different areas of the brain without needing a direct connection at all times physically. It may also provide an additional level of computation, which provides the capacity to make decisions, what we might call free will. In addition to this, before I get to the gist of the takeaway I want to have from the semi-field, some speculations that I think are really interesting. It's of note that the heart actually generates a bigger EM field than the brain does. And what that might mean, I don't know, but I think it's pretty cool. And it makes me think of some classics that I enjoyed learning about. Back in ancient Egypt, they believed that the heart was the seat of the soul. And here pictured as the beast Ammut, who would devour the heart and essentially determine the judgment of the soul in question. So anyway, takeaways from what I'm talking about. Consciousness can be reasonably modeled as integrated information in a human-generated EM field that is contiguous with and ultimately inextricable from that of the Earth's and the cosmos. In other words, maybe simpler language, the view of self as a discrete entity can be challenged by findings and theories in contemporary neuroscience. I do need to bear in mind this idea that James had about radical empiricism. For any stretch of the foreseeable future, we're still going to have phenomenological experience to contend with. So this idea of a physical substrate of consciousness, take it with a grain of salt. But the idea essentially, again, is it could be integrated information in space. Before we move on to the next theory that we're going to discuss, we get put between a rock and a hard place sometimes in talking about these things. So there is this idea we need to address between yet another dichotomy in thought, that of pluralism versus holism. A lot of you have likely heard of this idea, the mind-body problem, also called the hard problem of neuroscience. This would be the issue that comes up when you're a pluralist and you need to explain how mind can emerge from bits of non-mind or sub-mind. So how particles come together and those particles form molecules and molecules form cells and all that, and how that builds consciousness to emerge. The alternative that a holist would have to grapple with would be, how can a mind stay intact if it is partitioned? And that is to say, if consciousness is a fundamental part of reality and is expressed variably, how can it be expressed at all when the whole of the universe is partitioned into parts? And we'll get into some of that. In order to talk about some of this in a contemporary scholastic type of way, we'll discuss this theory, integrated information theory. And I'll note that a lot of my commentary on this subject will be taken from actually Dr. Goodwin's paper. It's called Bodies and Minds, Heaps and Syllables. We published that in Synthes. It's a really good paper. Definitely recommend reading it. And this is his commentary on IIT, because I think it makes it approachable in the ways that paper may not be as clear immediately. IIT was developed by psychiatrist Giulio Tononi. It's basically just a way to predict what systems would have phenomenal experience and which ones won't. They offer a mathematical definition of what's called integratedness, which is a measure of precisely how sensitive every element is to every other element in a system. They test themselves with explaining pointed questions about consciousness, about like, why does it correlate with activity of the corticothalamic system, but not the activity of the cerebellum, despite the latter having more neurons? Or why they disappear during delta sleep and seizures, but not at other states with less overall activity in the brain? Or even more basic questions, when do babies acquire it? What about animals, computers, or even larger systems? Pictured here, you've got Uezumi on the left, who this quote is from, and then on the right is Giulio Tononi. Uezumi says, it must be emphasized that taking the phenomenology of consciousness as primary and asking how it can be implemented by physical mechanisms is the opposite approach usually taken in neuroscience. Start from neural mechanisms in the brain and ask under what conditions they give rise to consciousness. That's a typical way. While identifying the neural correlates of consciousness, it is hard to see how it could ever lead to a satisfactory explanation of what consciousness is and how it comes about. Earlier, I described consciousness as simply experience, a subject experiencing the universe. And if that wasn't satisfactory, which I would understand, here is perhaps a more concrete way to look at it, at least in the framework of IIT. It is compositional. It's a whole composed of parts, integrated, that is strongly irreducible to non-interdependent components, and has exclusion. The experience as a whole, which excludes other experiences and experiencers, and also covers the way in such systems can contain numerous subsystems within their own phenomena, varying degrees of awareness or dimness that are nevertheless overtaken by larger and more integrated systems. So I'll bring this up again later, but with regard to the last part, you could imagine maybe a cell having an experience within your body. That cell is contained within an organ, which might have an experience in your body. And then, of course, the organ is a part of the organism. So those would be maybe like analogies of the subsystems that could be contained within larger integrated systems. This is more commentary by Dr. Goodwin. So in short, they show both theoretically and experimentally how the loss and recovery of phenomenal experience is associated with breakdown and recovery of information integration. It is worth note that these systems don't have to be biological to predict the same results. So any kind of integrated system would provide the model. So in this quote here, there's this phi reference. Essentially, that's just the measure of integratedness in a system. And if it's shown to be robust to predict predictive validity, we could provide a rationale for measuring phi in supersystems like ecosystems, biosphere, or the universe to speculate more rigorously on whether or not such systems could possess experiential properties or consciousness. So yeah, whether or not a galaxy is conscious, it's a super weird question, but I think it's worth asking. All right, and then to kind of wrap up on some of this, there's this idea of supervenience that can maybe provide like a philosophical rationale for why this priority holism or priority monism is maybe a good way to think about mind. Supervenience is essentially saying parts can supervene upon their whole, but wholes don't need to supervene on their parts. This has direct consequences for what we consider to be emergence. That is, wholes can display emergent properties when proper parts are arranged in a particular way, a just so kind of way. But the opposite, submergence, can't happen. That would be when proper parts are arranged in such a way that their intrinsic properties disappear. That can't happen because any intrinsic property of the part only adds to the properties of the whole. The relations between parts also translate to the whole. And since that's not metaphysically possible or observed, Dr. Goodwin says, holism is the only view which can give a complete inventory of the universe. I'm not here to tell you he's right, but I'm here to tell you that's a useful perspective. So again, just trying to recap things to keep it as clear as this stuff can be. Consciousness can be reasonably modeled as an integrated node of information that can be individuated complex within more robustly integrated information. Again, harken back to the idea of a cell within an organ within a body. And then with regard to holism, there exists compelling philosophical arguments, thank you, Dr. Goodwin, that consciousness can and perhaps must be expressions of a greater pool of information that can also exhibit consciousness, which would be considered brute or a fundamental aspect of reality in this scenario. So just like spin and charge are considered fundamental aspects of reality, in this view, consciousness would be a fundamental aspect of reality. And I know it sounds wacky, but I do think it has pragmatic uses, both intellectually and in terms of our work. And we'll get further along in this talk to hopefully convey some of that. Okay, so recap, I won't read that to you and insult your intelligence, but I'll tell you where we're going next. So mind can be observed experiencing what's relatively real to varying degrees of truth, dependent on the robustness of the informational integration. There's a theoretical maximum of integration. So that would be categorically integrated information or data from all of reality, irrespective to space and time in which that those events would be taking place. That is a concept I'll call absolute reality, and hopefully I'll make more sense of that here in a second. All right. So related to these ideas of absolute reality and relatively real, I'm going to give these ideas of absolute consciousness and relative consciousness. Absolute consciousness would be inaccessible to us. Again, just kind of a categorical experience of integrated information all through the universe. Of course, that would contain many subcomplexes that would probably yield antithetical or paradoxical perspectives when viewed in isolation. Related to that would be relative consciousness. This is inescapable to us. This is what we experience. Sufficiently integrated information of phenomena relative to a central node of experience, a human. This too is very likely a sum of integrated subcomplexes, again, cells, organs. Compared in isolation might yield antithetical or paradoxical perspectives. And sometimes, our bodies, different parts of our bodies are at odds with each other. So that's not too far-fetched, I don't think. Okay, to maybe make some of this more approachable, there is a good parable. This one is an Indian parable. The adaptation I have here is by James Baldwin. I won't read all of this to you. I'll just try to get the gist across. Stories about 6 blind men who stood by the road every day. They often heard of elephants. They sounded cool, I'm sure. They probably felt their footsteps stomping around and everything. And they wanted to observe it and see, what was an elephant like? What is an elephant? And so this is a story about how these 6 men, each from his own relative vantage, felt the elephant and gave a perspective as to what it might be. The first one is on the bottom here. He says, well, now I know all about this beast. He's exactly like a wall. This gentleman here, I think. There's the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. They all give their perspective based on what they feel from the elephant. One says he's like a spear, one says he's like a snake, one says it's like a tree, another a fan, and then the last one a rope. And this next picture can kind of give an idea of how they would have derived those perspectives. At the end of the story, it says, when the elephant moved on, the 6 blind men sat by the roadside all day and quarreled about him. Each believed that he knew just how the animal looked, and each called the others names because they did not agree with him. People who have eyes sometimes act as foolishly. So this gets to the question of truth versus true. The story can be applied in a lot of different ways. It's essentially in any way that there's a phenomenon that can be viewed from variable vantages. Some of these things would be what we call conflicts, introspection of an individual person. One example is what we do for work, which is extrospection of an individual person. And some of what we're talking about here today would be like extrospection of a field of science, which would be neuroscience, psychology, any number of things that we utilize on a day-to-day basis, which is why there are so many different schools of thought and so many disagreements that I'm kind of highlighting today. The structural model of the mind that I'm going to tell you about is kind of founded on this observation that relative vantages beget idiosyncratic, variably true perspectives. I like this picture. So maybe more concise. Elephant and the blind man. Just to hit this home, because again, this is abstruse, nebulous stuff. Relative consciousness is part experiencing parts. Think of a person. Absolute consciousness is the whole experiencing the whole. Think the idea of God without any of the dogmatic applications. Relative truth is that which experience, or relative experience demands to be so. So a biased partition of absolute truth. And absolute truth being what is real, irrespective to the perspective gleaned from any relative vantage. Again, this could hardly be fathomed by any one person. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the structural model I mentioned. Again, this is not to be taken literally in any kind of capacity. This is really just a concept to facilitate what I'm talking about today. Hopefully it helps. I hope it doesn't muddy the water even more. An individual could be said to have an integrated psyche, or a partition of accessible psyche, something I'm going to call the ego colonnade, which would be composed of less robust complexes or frames. Each frame contains a vantage of the rest of the colonnade and the space outside of it, with variable validity given the limitations of that vantage. The colonnade representing the way a person would view their own psyche, their egoic psyche, and the outside world being the way they would view the world from that psyche. Frames and colonnade interface to extrapolate a some perspective of self or other, what I'll call a mosaic that can be variably coherent, or in the case of pathology, incoherent. We'll get more into that in a second. Just to play along with the psychoanalytic perspective, the ego, that's why I call it the ego colonnade. It represents the axis of the colonnade itself. The superego is the blueprint by which the frames are inspected for faults or deviants, and the id would be the cathectic creation or destruction of frames, basically as a means to an end of desired perceptions. With regard to applying this, thinking of this ego colonnade, it's not static. It's not a building that stands unchanged. It's actually very dynamic. It's as a result of shifting frames, which can contain subframe perspectives. Think about looking left or right in one of the spaces between the columns. And they can change on a whim. So frames can and do generate paradoxical or antithetical perspectives. Again, think back to the idiosyncratic truths. Ego colonnade's degree of functionality would be a factor of compatibility between its frames, i.e. they contribute to a coherent mosaic rather than an incoherent mosaic. It's important to note that I'm not suggesting uniformity between frames or between different people's colonnades. Rather, it's the coherence that's important. And again, that's the coherence idea we're going to get to in a moment. Okay, so I touched on the structural model. Just to review, overall, self and other do exist, even if it's only by means of illusion. Consciousness can be reasonably modeled as integrated information in human-generated EM fields. Human consciousness can reasonably be modeled as an integrated node of information that can be an individuated complex within more robustly integrated information. And then what we just went over with regard to this idea of this colonnade and a mosaic, or a coherent or incoherent mosaic of experience and perspective. Okay, so through both CEMI and IIT, we can kind of say the degree of consciousness would be determined by holistic informational integration. My takeaway there with regard to application to psychology would be the degree of holistic psychological functionality could be said to be determined by the salient coherence of its parts. And conceptual self is dynamic in continuous flux and is experienced as variably coherent, even in healthy individuals. So my extrapolation from all that, psychological wellness is determined by salient coherence in the concept of self and conscious beings, despite invariably dynamic precepts. Sorry about the language. I know it might not be super clear. I'm going to try to make it more approachable here in the next few minutes. So there's basically what I just said, the psychological wellness part. Psychological illness would kind of just be the opposite. So you can take from that what will be the transformational theory, and we'll elaborate this a bit. One who is psychologically ill can become well via development of coherence in the conceptual self. So what's coherence? I want to take a brief detour into discussing this idea of coherence. Throw a shout out to Dr. Caudill. He will, I apologize if you haven't done this year already and for exposing PGY1s and 2s to this, but he asks this question of us, and I think it's a good question. So really people come to see us for one reason, and he wants to know, what is that reason? I'm paraphrasing this, of course. It's dysphoria. People want to see change in their life away from dysphoric circumstances or perspectives and to feel better for any number of reasons they might come to the office. So think back to the experiential mosaic or back to the elephant and the blind man. Parts can tell us some truths about the overall truth of an experienced whole, i.e. a person, assuming those truths aren't exclusionary of other truths, or i.e. parts aren't misrepresented regarding the roles in the whole. So one way to say what coherence is, a longer version of that, is here on this page. I won't read it to you, but the shorter version is just to say incoherence is essentially dysphoria. That's what we would experience as dysphoria. We'll dig into it a little more. Here's the transformational theory, and in one sentence, iteration 2. There it is for you to read. But we still have a problem. What's diminishing the whole? So a whole is a tricky subject. I'm not trying to come to a consensus. Even in some of the content I've presented today, the whole could be defined very differently. So the whole being a measure of a relative conscious being, perhaps a human. You could ask, is that the field's EM, or the brain's EM field, or the heart's, or their integrated field, or is it have to include the Earth's, the cosmos, and all that? It gets to be a tricky question. So I think a person's whole has to be personal and dynamic in its revelation, to be elaborated through a course of being, never to be definitive, and never to be decided prior to engagement. Diminishing the whole would really be just defining it categorically in accordance with a preconceived ideal of either the patient or the provider. So here's iteration 3. One who is psychologically ill can become well by apprehending the validity of salient parts in their conceptual self without definitively defining the respective whole. We'll make that more approachable here in a moment. Just for clarity's sake, I want to say, when I'm talking about this, absolute consciousness is to relative consciousness, as relative consciousness, that of a human's, is to a part or a frame of their ego colonnade, or a partitioned relative consciousness. Our role, as I see it, are to guide patients to embrace the ineffability of their true identity, which is the inaccessible absolute, the whole that we cannot grasp in its entirety, while simultaneously encouraging clearer resolution through elaborative being, to an end of tolerable dysphoria. That's what I call the pluralistic compromise. So acknowledging both pluralism and holism as meaningful and useful tools. Yeah, and if social media is teaching us much of anything, it's that people can and will find evidence to support whatever true they wish to be truth, capital T. Tons of echo chambers out there. So if we can consider a person's being as illusory and inconstant, and consider it simultaneously to be undeniably implicit, it really just depends on where we're looking and what we're thinking. Again, not asking who's right. We're asking, so what? What are we going to do with it? The pessimism of this theory is you can never know your true identity. The optimism is you can know it better than you do now, and it's open to reformation. Picture of Schrodinger's cat there. I wanted to include an iteration of the transformative theory, the idea, and more informal language. And essentially, it's just to be well. Stop deciding who and what you are, and go elaborate who and what that might be. To put it into the language of the quantum physics, I wanted to do the Schrodinger cat picture. I'm suggesting we train patients to stop reflexively collapsing the waveform from digging into one singular vantage of witnessing themselves in the universe. So putting it all together, just going back to that idea of the colonnade, we're not deciding an ideal colonnade. There is no such thing other than one that generates a mosaic that is coherent. It would be passive work, secondary to active experiential elaborating. And something I think is important to note is this model allows for diverse expressions of wellness. So there's not one mode of consciousness that's right. You can be different and you can be well. I think I'm okay enough on time to go through some of this. So I think something that can kind of hit some of this home is the idea of the default mode network. It has been likened to the conceptual ego. Default mode network is essentially a functional circuitry that has been identified in functional MRI imaging. And a proposed function, this quote is taken from Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. It pays deference to reality and diligently seeks to represent the world as precisely as possible by minimization of uncertainty. And that certainly makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. The ability to do that is vital to the survivability of an organism. Being able to differentiate self from other and the environment, obviously that has huge implications for surviving when you're in the wilderness. However, this system can be hypertrophied, as is the case with just about anything. And a whole range of psychiatric disorders would be possibly well explained through some form of overactivity of the default mode network. Some of you may know that I'm interested in the therapeutic use of psychedelics as it's been described in recent research. It's got promising results. I think, of course, the compounds, there's a lot to learn, and it's hard to make sweeping statements about them at the moment. But they're promising. There's some cool stuff. And my interest in psychedelics really isn't with the compounds themselves. It's really with how they line up with these ideas and how they can consistently convey what's called a mystical experience. I'll talk about that here in a moment, but this slide here is talking a little more about the default mode network, showing some of the areas in the brain that have been implicated. I've also read recent papers about subcortical regions being implicated too. So we're still learning about this. But if the DMN is an analog of what we call the ego, it essentially is what we're targeting in a lot of our psychotherapy. Yeah, so there's that. Okay, so default mode network and psychedelics. So how they interact. Psychedelics are said to basically temporarily disrupt this default mode network. A good representation of this I really like is over here. The sober brain, it shows here, these little dots are different brain areas, and these lines are connections or communications between these areas. So you can see if a person takes a therapeutic dose of a psychedelic, the way that the brain chatters with itself, it can be very different. And you can see, like, with all these different associations between or communications, you can have different associations in the brain. So synesthesia, hallucinations, basically dissolving of the boundaries of self and other that people will talk about. That is in many cases in people who undergo this kind of a treatment, they have what's called a mystical experience, where the boundaries of self and other are kind of dissolved, and there is a beautiful unity to the experience, or to the universe. Of course, psychedelics aren't required for that experience. There's some actually good literature about how other ways to achieve that. Psychedelics are just maybe the most consistent way to achieve that. So that is essentially the entirety of my interest in psychedelics. It's really related to that. I'll talk more about that in a bit. But so you've seen the theory and a lot of its underpinnings as far as like other theories that are out there. There's a recap in case anyone's still kind of like what. But I'll move on a little bit. We need to make it actionable. This has all been pretty heady stuff. So a lot of my influence with how I approach therapy, what it actually looks like for me, comes from the contextual model, which is really well outlined in this book, The Great Psychotherapy Debate. Like I mentioned here, what I do in therapy is actually a lot simpler than what I've been talking about today. And I think that stuff's compelling and adds to why I do what I do. So during training, we're all introduced to different masters of different therapy techniques, and that's great. It's a great resource to be able to have, but my question isn't really so much who's right, which therapy is the best therapy, CBT versus dynamics, who knows? What we can say is there actually have been factors in therapy that have been delineated as to what makes therapy effective. And so this is a part of the contextual model. These factors in therapy are called the common factors of effective psychotherapy. And here are some of these things. Some of the more important ones, as far as the effect size go, having a consensus and a collaboration on the goal in therapy, the expression of empathy, of alliance, positive regard. There are a lot of different things, and there are some things that don't matter that you might think do. Like here, for example, expertise in a specific presenting problem, or don't matter. Therapist modality, even with specific degree, sometimes doesn't matter. So those are important to know. So what does my therapy look like? There are three sections I kind of use. First is acknowledgement, second acceptance, and third is what I call transcendence. I have these split into subsections of how I approach. You can read them there: illumination, contextualization, detection, development, refinement, or elaboration and refinement. Here I'm kind of providing some ways I might document about that. Sorry, I'm trying to wrap it up a little bit because I know that we want to have time for comments and discussion and stuff. Yeah, I might document it this way. A patient has illuminated dysphoria as being a result of dysphoric frames. That is a yes or no, and then I might give some descriptions about how that is playing out there. Again, yes or no description, yes or no description. Same kind of thing here. And we'll get into some examples here in a minute, or actually right now. So patient presents with depression. After a few sessions of building some rapport and developing therapeutic alliance, therapist identifies presence of several cognitive distortions directly contributing to the dysphoria. So how do I approach it? First one, again, is illumination. So guide the patient on a very general level that their dysphoria is generated by disagreement between their distortions and reality. Essentially, really, that's what that's saying is readiness for therapy. The patient showing up with the idea that something needs to change, something has to give. Two, which is contextualization, guide the patient to find what is true about the distortions and why they've been partially adaptive. I think a lot of us have a tendency to want to deny that the distortions have a basis in reality because they do disagree with reality. But in fact, I see a lot of that to be, as far as the development of the distortions, I see it to be as adaptive. Something that serves the patient at some point in life that no longer serves them and contributes to dysphoria. So making sense of that is important. Third one would be detection. So guide the patient to identify ways in which these distortions have contributed to incoherence in their experience. And four being development, employ CBT methods to directly confront just cognitive distortions. So again, I'm not rewriting the book of psychiatry here. I'm using the tools we have available to us. I think CBT can be applied in this framework, and you can still have good results. Five would be elaboration. So guiding the patient towards consistent, sustainable methods to apply the lessons learned in the confrontations. And then six, applying those new truths learned while navigating both familiar and novel experiences in a process of what I call iterative refinement, which I did with my transformational theory today for you guys. So continuing to refine that idea of self through refinement. I have several examples here. I think we got enough time probably. So same patient shows up and remains depressed, though has improved insight. In fact, the insight is contributing to further dysphoria. They've come to see the same processes occurring in their day-to-day life, though now they're not necessarily acting on these thoughts and feelings. So what's next? Same kind of process, illuminating basically readiness for therapy and guiding to see, why these thoughts and feelings were adaptive or are adaptive for the patient and going on through the process to an end of refining through iterative engagement with life. And then in example 3, this is kind of the dreaded therapy patient with delusions. What they are identified after building some alliance with the patient, no insight with regard to the delusions. One, again, in a very general way, something's got to give, something's not right. Assuming the patient is ready for therapy, which isn't always the case, we might be able to make some progress in a delusion. I don't know that we're going to be able to reverse it, but at least make it something that can be lived with in a more functional capacity. Maybe not perfect, but it's something. 2, kind of validating the feelings and historical origins of that delusion or the construct that they're presenting with, making sense of why the thoughts are there without confirming or validating the delusion itself. 3, this is the detection part. It's especially important to keep from invalidating the patient's perspective. It's a review of consequences of this delusional belief they have without challenging the belief itself. So we're neither validating or denying this delusional construct the patient has, rather exploring it. And then one way you could maybe approach it is through active mindfulness. Again, this is just one answer. We have an arsenal of tools in psychiatry by which we can address problems that present. And then again, elaborating and refining through iteration. Okay, so I think we're doing all right on time. A few closing remarks I want to make. A little bit about love. I talked about psyche and eros earlier. I mentioned also mystical experiences and how they don't have to be elicited by psychedelics. There is actually a great example. This excerpt is also taken from Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. And it's regarding Edgar Mitchell's experience returning to Earth. He had an experience of what he called Savikalpa Samadhi, when he realized that the molecules of his body, the spacecraft, his partners were prototyped in some ancient generation of stars. He felt an overwhelming sense of oneness, of connectedness. It wasn't them and us, that's me, all of it, one thing. And it was accompanied by an ecstatic feeling, a sense of, oh my God. Yes, it was an insight or an epiphany for him. So essentially, this experience could be said, parts recognizing that they are parts in a whole. Not becoming the whole or assuming that they know what it's all about, but experiencing the sense that they're connected. There has been an account of love that I have been fascinated with since I came across it. It's this guy, Dr. Abraham Tversky. He's a rabbi. He gives a commentary on it. It's pretty short, but essentially the meat of it is, if I give something to you, I've invested myself in you. And since self-love is a given, now that part of me has become in you, there's a part of me in you that I love. Basically contrasting a sort of cultivating invested love with the love of commodifiable traits, how we might make people vehicles for our gratification. So I disagree with him on one tidbit, and that is that self-love is a given. In fact, a lot of our work is kind of based on the fact that it's not. But what I can say is that I do believe the process of loving oneself is similar to loving other people in that regard. Finding parts of yourself that you don't love and making them a part of you, which is really what we're talking about today. One more slide on this. I promise I'm almost done. So going back to Psyche, she was transformed in the pursuit of Eros, something I find beautiful as a parallel to these ideas. And is my adaptation of finding self-love for patients and what we might encourage them to do. Now that part of me has become in me, there's a part of me in me that I love. So this expression of self is transformed in the pursuit of self-love, reconciling rejected parts that before contributed to a fragmented, incoherent whole. and generating a better integrated, more coherent whole. This is the drawing out and gathering up of consciousness that is the namesake of psychospagyria, as I've presented it to you. So before we do the questions, I want to say some special thanks. I want to say a special thank you to Matthew Neal here in the middle. I'm not going to put ideas in his mouth. I'm not saying he believes everything I believe, but he helped me develop a lot of the philosophical underpinnings. He helped me elaborate a lot of my ideas and kind of gave me a space to think and talk about it. So I really appreciate him for that. Same goes with Dr. Goodwin. I love the guy for it. My wife and my kid, and then the faculty and all my co-residents I've had a wonderful time with, of course, the fancy monkeys and Dr. Cardinal too. There are my references. Okay, I guess we can open the floor up now. Somebody's going to manage that apparently.
I've got some comments. To quote Dr. Strange, the multiverse, a concept about which we know frighteningly little. Any Spider-Man fans out there? I don't know if I have questions. I mean, you threw a lot at us, and it would take a minute to chew on all that. Fortunately, I have chewed on a lot of that, and so I just have some comments to throw at you. The Eros and Psyche reference is great. I love that. It's folklore has classified that as a Beauty and the Beast variant, which can be found in every culture that's been studied so far. So there's the evidence for an archetype that represents, I think, the process that you're referring to, but on an abstract and symbolic level. But the semi theory too is really interesting. Part of the issue with the integrated information theory and the semi theory is the qualia problem, which is okay, so if consciousness is the electromagnetic field, well then why is it that an electromagnetic field that looks this way feels like that rather than something else? So that's the qualia problem. I think you can answer that with holism if you assume that the universe is conscious, and you'd have to read my paper to get the full explanation for that. But the other idea that popped in as I was listening to you was the psychedelic experiences of oneness and the mystical experiences which don't require psychedelics necessarily. There are some folks out there who use breathing techniques to achieve that same state and so forth. But those sorts of things are explainable in a more meaningful way if you assume some sort of panpsychism. So by that I mean, and this is William James's thing, is talking about if there's psyche everywhere, the brain would have had to evolve to take advantage of it, right? But it would not necessarily want constant, cosmic consciousness all day long. So wouldn't evolution, I mean, I'd actually like your comments on this. It seems to me that makes for a really good explanation for why we would have biological pieces in place to limit it, which is probably what these psychedelics do, is kind of turn those off so that you can experience it. Well, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm in absolute agreement. When I was talking about the default mode network and the evolutionary advantages it could convey in organisms trying to survive in a hostile world, if you're experiencing cosmic consciousness all day, you're going to have a lot of trouble distinguishing a healthy berry from a poisonous berry.
Right.
And you're very likely to die and have your genome wiped from the progression of evolution. So yeah, I think absolutely the default mode network essentially could be a type of limiting of the experience of consciousness, and that psychedelics or mystical experiences at large could be a disruption of that process. And the experience itself can be very confusing and difficult to integrate into meaningful information or ideas. Hence, I think the importance of having a therapeutic setting for something like that to happen.
well, I'm just going to keep going. My other question for you is, since you mentioned coherence, I was wondering if you were familiar with other approaches to psychotherapy which use similar concepts. So like in analytical psychology, they talk about individuation or integration of the psyche. Or in self-psychology, you see similar concepts as well. And in holistic psychology, Gestalt, you see another type of, but all of these, I think, are just looking at the same sort of thing you're talking about, which is you see someone coming in and they're not integrated with themselves. There's pieces, parts that want different things. And if I'm not misreading you here, what you're saying is that you're trying to lead them to where the pieces work together now, rather than in opposition to each other. Yeah.
Yes. And I can't say I'm a guru with Gestalt or self-psychology or ego theory, but yes, I am at least loosely familiar with some of the similar language.
Usually means you're onto something.
Hopefully, I like to think so.
A lot of other people have described it in similar language.
I like to think so.
Dr. DeWitt, it's Dr. Stewart. I enjoyed your talk. Good job. And enjoyed to hear you and Dr. Goodwin go back and forward too. So I must say, yes, I'm sort of, as a spectator, having a good time with this presentation, and it's definitely challenged me to think about some things. Just on something sort of not completely encompassing the depth of what you're talking about, just the idea of mystical experiences without psychedelics. The National Foundation of Shamanic Studies, which is part of this organization that was started by this guy named Michael Harner, he really promotes the use of drumming for shamanic consciousness and mystical experiences, and had for many years really pushed the fact that the majority of indigenous, or where a lot of shamanism comes from, used drumming more than it did psychedelics. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but he always contended that. And so again, there's so many paths. I think about music and as particularly you and music and your relationship to that. And anyway, just found it all really interesting. Thanks again for your effort on this presentation. It's really a good job.
Thank you. I think I've heard similar things. And I've read a book about whether or not maybe people have used psychedelics across the world. And we have a good information about Mesoamerica, but over in Europe, there's some ideas that maybe Greece. But yeah, I mean, part of that's just a matter of incomplete historical record. But yes, drumming, breathing, fire, nighttime, a lot of different similarities across cultures that may not have communicated at all.
Hey, Abe.
Hey.
It's Ethan. Like the presentation, I think it's something that I think inherently makes people a little uncomfortable because it's on such a macro scale, and we're trying to answer the kind of deepest, darkest secrets of the universe. But you and I have talked a significant amount about relational frame theory, which is kind of the basis of ACT therapy, which I've gotten super involved with, and basically kind of the idea that as humans, we're kind of evolutionarily set apart with this secondary neurological mechanism that we reference as the mind, that is able to essentially kind of predict the future without us having directly learned experiences, and be able to be really creative and imaginative. And we've had some prolonged discussions about that. I was just wondering if you were able to at all kind of tie, because there's a lot of similarities here. You talked about acceptance, which is, I mean, absolutely paramount in acceptance and commitment therapy. But can you tie any theoretical framework together within RFT and that word that you're using that I've already forgotten, psychospagiric or whatever, Can you just comment on that, or do you have anything to add? Or
Yeah, I can comment a little bit. So in my understanding of relational frame theory, essentially you're taking two ideas at its core, you're taking two ideas that may not be immediately relatable and drawing associations between them through what might be called cold entropy and some in the theories that are kind of feeding into this default mode network idea. And that's what the default mode network tries to cut down on. I think creativity is maybe to some degree the ability to look past those limiting functions of the brain that facilitate survival, that facilitate concrete understanding and less uncertainty perceived in the world around you. So I think in my mind, RFT is really a theoretical framework to help people train this ability that we have, this creative ability to draw associations, to make connections that might not otherwise be apparent in a day-to-day life. I don't know if that made any sense, but that was my rambling at the moment.
no, I mean, I think it makes some sense. I think where kind of the mind gets hijacked is when people kind of buy in maybe a little bit too much to the things their mind is able to come up with, without that kind of understanding or framework that that's what it's supposed to do. And it's not supposed to mean that everything that you think of is based in reality or accurate. But rather that is the mechanism. Evolutionarily, it makes a lot of sense in order to avoid potential harms or enhance your chance of survival by kind of getting you to do things that would be pro-social or make you more likely to survive. I think it's really interesting within the framework of what you're talking about, because there is, and I think what Dr. Goodwin was talking about at his previous grand rounds with the collective unconscious and kind of the passage of these stories through time, despite the lack of any direct experience, kind of taking the idea of relational frame theory to the next level in the fact that even experiences can be inherited and passed down. So yeah, I mean, I think overall it's a very thick topic, and there's not a lot of absolutes, and I think that makes it kind of hard to wrap your head around it. But I certainly appreciate you going to the links that you've gone to kind of develop the theory, and certainly appreciate helping me try to understand it better. So I do thank you for tackling a big challenge in this presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways you're absolutely right. This is hard to approach. It's scary, and I didn't mention during the course of presenting, but I will say, as far as like the underpinnings, the theoretical ideas behind the theory, the patient doesn't really need to be exposed to much of any of that if it's not warranted or appropriate. Really, the things that matter as far as interfacing with the patient would be the parts of the contextual model I mentioned, and just the general approach to addressing dysphoria as it might present.
I think you scared everyone else away.
I'm sorry. I told them they didn't exist and they ran.
Yeah, exactly.
Damn me.
Thank you, Dr. DeWitt, for your presentation. There being no further questions, I'm going to give people a minute or two back and get everybody on time for their 1 o'clocks.
I'll just say thank you too. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Abe. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
All right, man. Thank you.